My name is Lisa Walker. I've inhabited this earth for 43 years, and across 18 of those, I've existed primarily as Richard Walker's spouse, relegating myself to secondary importance with practiced ease. That particular evening, the prestigious Whitmore Group commemorated its silver anniversary celebration inside the downtown Marriott's opulent ballroom. All shimmering crystals suspended overhead, pristine linens adorning every surface, and musicians producing what sounded like symphony-grade compositions. My husband had expended a full 60 minutes preceding our departure, perfecting his appearance before the mirror, deliberately outlining which iteration of myself would prove acceptable for the occasion. Wear the navy ensemble, he'd instructed rather than requested. And Lisa, please moderate your conversational contributions this evening. These individuals represent significant business interests. I complied without resistance, as I perpetually did when compliance purchased tranquility. Inside that glittering space, Richard underwent his customary metamorphosis, laughing with exaggerated enthusiasm at colleagues' remarks, positioning his hand against others' shoulders, navigating the room with the calculated precision of someone auditioning for a superior existence. I shadowed him, maintaining strategic smiles whenever introductions occurred, which happened infrequently. Predominantly, I remained adjacent to the appetizer display, holding an untouched glass of pale wine, observing my spouse's carefully orchestrated performance. At one juncture, he extracted me aside, his grip upon my upper arm becoming uncomfortably firm, his breath warming my ear with unmistakable sharpness. "Don't humiliate me," he whispered. "You're positioned there as though you're completely friendless. Display more enthusiasm. Participate in dialogue." I experienced the familiar ache materializing within my chest. That persistent, unwelcome heaviness I'd inhabited so thoroughly, I'd scarcely registered its constant presence anymore, resembling the way one ceases noticing the rhythmic hum emanating from deteriorating household infrastructure. I declined to protest. Resistance had never been part of my vocabulary. I simply acknowledged his directive and retreated once more into solitude, monitoring my husband reintegrate himself with a constellation of expensively dressed professionals who appeared wholly indifferent to my existence. I must clarify something regarding my fundamental nature before proceeding further. I've never been someone inclined toward complaint or self-pity. My upbringing instilled the conviction that reticent women possess genuine fortitude, that swallowing one's anguish constituted a particular form of nobility. Consequently, I remained positioned in that navy garment, deliberately inconspicuous, constructing narratives in my consciousness that weren't remotely authentic. This particular evening simply represented marriage's inevitable reality after 18 years of shared residence. I told myself repeatedly, though each reassurance rang progressively more hollow. The atmosphere transformed perceptibly before comprehension caught up with perception. Discussions diminished to undertones. Attention redirected toward the entrance. Following the collective gaze, I perceived him, Charles Whitmore, the organization's proprietor and principal shareholder. I'd overheard Richard reference this individual perpetually, his tone oscillating between trepidation and covetous hunger, the manner ambitious men discuss those controlling their professional destinies. Charles Whitmore presented as 62 years of age, featuring distinguished silver hair and commanding physical stature that necessitated no exertion to dominate spatial awareness. He traversed the assembled crowd, engaging in handshakes and momentary conversations, though his eyes persistently scanned beyond immediate acquaintances, searching for something unspecified. Then his attention located me. Something transpired within his expression that I struggle articulating accurately, even retrospectively. Recognition didn't constitute the precise sensation, not initially, at least. The encounter more closely resembled witnessing someone perceive a phantom he'd abandoned hope of ever encountering again. His current conversation evaporated mid-sentence. He simply stood motionless, observing me across that expansive, densely populated room, and my corporeal sensations became decidedly frigid because I possessed absolutely zero knowledge of his identity. He commenced walking in my direction, not toward Richard, not toward anyone else of apparent importance, directly toward my position. The crowd parted instinctively the way it invariably does for commanding individuals, and I remained transfixed beside the appetizer arrangement, my wine glass suddenly acquiring impossible weight, wondering whether I'd committed some egregious social transgression. Whether I was about to receive censure for occupying excessive physical space. He halted immediately before me. Proximity revealed his eyes as pale gray and distinctly lacrimal. "It's you," he articulated nearly inaudibly above the string quartet's background accompaniment. Subsequently, he extended his hand, clasping mine between both of his, and his articulation elevated as his voice fractured perceptibly. "I've dedicated 20 years to locating you." The ballroom surrendered to absolute silence. I'm not employing metaphor, conversations literally terminated. The quartet persisted performing, yet nobody remained attentive. Every single individual within that architectural space rotated to observe this powerful businessman maintaining my hand, apparently experiencing emotional distress over a woman nobody had previously deemed consequential enough to acknowledge. I examined his physiognomy frantically for something recognizable and discovered absolutely nothing. "I apologize," I articulated uncertainly, my vocal register becoming thin and unconvincing. "I believe you've confused me with another individual." "No," he shook his head persistently, maintaining a firmer hold upon my hand. Genuine tears commenced descending across his features before an assembled multitude of corporate directors, executives, and subordinate personnel. "No, I would recognize your countenance indefinitely. 20 years wouldn't alter that recognition." I glanced past his shoulder and discovered Richard stationed near the beverage service, his drinking vessel suspended midway to his mouth, his physiognomy draining of all characteristic assurance. He manifested like a man witnessing his entire worldview fragmenting in genuine time. Standing there with this unknown man's tears dampening my hand, I understood with complete certainty that the woman this distinguished individual sought represented someone I'd practically managed erasing from my consciousness entirely. I maintained contact with his hand, the entire ballroom seemingly suspending respiration in anticipation of explanation I couldn't provide since I remained fundamentally mystified regarding this man's identity. I examined his features again, the silver-toned hair, the pale irises, the pronounced facial lines suggesting a lifetime encompassing both accomplishment and something considerably more challenging underneath, yet nothing crystallized into recognition. I attempted again, gently retrieving my hand, my inflection conveying apology. "I genuinely cannot identify you." Something shifted within his countenance, softening as though he'd anticipated precisely this response. He wiped away his tears unashamedly with his hand's dorsal surface, disregarding the hundreds of observant faces surrounding us. That particular vulnerability, a commercially successful man demonstrating emotional authenticity before his entire institutional hierarchy, communicated something his subsequent words couldn't have articulated as efficiently. Powerful males rarely demonstrate lacrimation in ballroom settings unless something has ruptured fundamentally through their emotional architecture. 20 years previous, he commenced, his articulation more controlled now though continuing to carry emotional resonance, I was traversing my route homeward from Charlotte traveling along Route 9. A violent meteorological event descended, the variety where meteorological visibility extends scarcely 3 feet beyond vehicular illumination. My automobile encountered black ice and subsequently departed the thoroughfare, depositing itself within a roadside channel. My vehicle sustained catastrophic damage along its operator's side. I couldn't manipulate the door mechanism. I couldn't perceive sensation originating from my lower extremities. Something indistinct commenced clarifying within my cognitive depths, hazy recollection resembling previously forgotten dreaming. I was approximately 29 years old, he persisted, recently concluded from matrimonial union, consuming substances excessively, operating my automobile with insufficient caution because my personal welfare seemed inconsequential that particular calendar year. I genuinely anticipated experiencing mortality within that channel. Subsequently, I perceived a woman. She'd been navigating opposite directional flow, observed my vehicle's tail illumination at peculiar positioning, and halted her progression. The nebulous reminiscence acquired substantive definition. an establishment providing meals and beverages. Extended work rotation. Precipitation drumming insistently against my antiquated Honda's windshield. She descended into that channel inside freezing rainfall, he articulated, dressed exclusively in service industry uniform, lacking protective outer covering, and she manipulated that door utilizing her unprotected hands until they bled. She accomplished my extrication. She maintained compression upon my cranial laceration util. Easing her personal headwrap throughout that emergency transport because I continued hemorrhaging and she wouldn't relinquish her grip upon me. Her presence at that healthcare facility persisted until I achieved sufficient stability for operative intervention. That's precisely the reason I'm positioned within this chamber, Mrs. Walker. The architectural floor seemed to oscillate beneath my positioning. I was approximately 23 years old throughout that period, laboring through nocturnal shifts within a dining establishment situated external to Charlotte, financing my daytime education at an accessible community institution, continuing to nurture conviction that my life possessed purposeful trajectory. I remembered that meteorological catastrophe. I remembered that masculine individual's automobile compressed like a consumable beverage container within a channel. I remembered his vocalizations when I finally manipulated that entrance portal, something oscillating between lament and laughter. I remembered his blood upon my outer wrap. I remembered departing before consciousness returned to him. I possessed exclusively your initial appellation, Charles articulated, and his inflection now carried something approaching desperate pleading, communicating his necessity for comprehension regarding the temporal expanse preceding this moment. Lisa, that's exclusively what registered upon that healthcare facility's admission documentation, where you authenticated treatment authorization as emergency contact, providing them authority for intervention. I regained consciousness and you disappeared, and I exhausted months pursuing you. I revisited every dining establishment within circumference of 50 miles. Subsequently, when financial resources finally permitted, I compensated an investigator. But Lisa represents an exceedingly common appellation, and you generated zero traceable documentation. I never succeeded in locating you. I didn't conceptualize that it mattered, I articulated softly, and I communicated honestly. Within my consciousness, I'd executed what anyone should perform. I hadn't remained expecting gratification since I didn't contemplate myself deserving acknowledgement for merely failing to navigate past an expiring individual. My existence demanded continuation, a dining establishment position concluding at dawn, a maternal figure requiring financial assistance with residential payment. Throughout those 20 intervening years, I considered that individual residing within that channel exclusively as a stranger I'd encountered and assisted during a particularly difficult meteorological circumstance. However, for him apparently, it constituted the juncture around which his complete existence rotated. You resurrected my existence during a period I possessed zero legitimate motivation continuing it, Charles articulated. Subsequently you vanished as though you'd never manifested, Mrs. Walker. He paused, allowing comprehension to establish itself. I constructed this commercial enterprise throughout the years subsequent to that occurrence. Every determination I formulated, I conceptualized as a male comprehending he'd obtained genuine second existence through someone's magnanimity, someone requesting absolutely nothing in reciprocation. I searched for you across 2 decades because I never acquired the opportunity expressing gratitude appropriately. I became gradually conscious of spatial reality once more, observational expressions surrounding us, handheld electronic devices ascending incrementally, a murmur propagating via the assembled crowd's posterior regions. I perceived someone articulating in elevated tones, "That constitutes Richard's matrimonial partner." Richard remained uninformed. I deliberately avoided observing Richard. Unnecessary, I could perceive his humiliation radiating across that architectural expanse like thermal energy ascending from summer-heated concrete. And experiencing that phenomenon produced something I hadn't experienced throughout considerable duration. Sensation other than impulse for self-diminishment, intended for his protection. Charles Whitmore maintained the moment's intensity. Numerous males would have concluded their declaration and retreated, ashamed of emotional demonstration before subordinates. Charles performed differently. He rotated to confront the assembled multitude, maintaining one hand positioned lightly adjacent my elbow, as though apprehensive I'd dissolve again, should he discontinue physical anchoring me to material reality. Subsequently, he elevated his articulation, so the collective ballroom perceived every articulation distinctly. "I want every individual present comprehending precisely who this woman represents," he proclaimed. The chamber, already hushed, appeared to lean progressively inward with heightened concentration. 20 years prior, anteceding this commercial organization's establishment, anteceding each of your employments, I was expiring within a channel alongside an obscure thoroughfare. This woman extracted me utilizing purely her unprotected hands. She accompanied me throughout emergency conveyance. She remained until my physiological functions stabilized, subsequently departing without communicating her appellation, requesting absolutely nothing, demonstrating zero expectation of gratification. A murmur resonated via the assembled masses. I perceived bored constituents exchanging meaningful glances, younger professionals extracting communication devices for documentation, observing expressions indicating the category of admiration, customarily reserved for celebrated performers, rather than weary females in economically accessible attire. Should she have declined assistance that particular evening, Charles persisted, there exists no Whitmore group. There exists zero occupational situations within this chamber. There exists zero commemorative occasion. Each individual here whose constructed professional trajectory, residential security, and viable future through this commercial operation acknowledges implicit obligation to a female nobody acknowledged until tonight's revelation. I perceived my husband's frozen positioning near that beverage dispenser, resembling a male experiencing his complete comprehension of existence, fragmenting in observable increments. I registered something unfamiliar propagating via my thoracic cavity as Charles redirected focus toward Richard, and thermal perception within the chamber appeared to descend noticeably. "Richard," he articulated, and my spouse flinched audibly upon hearing his appellation communicated by this individual. "Your matrimonial partner preserved my existence. I've contemplated that evening's narrative throughout 2 decades, wondering regarding this woman's identification. You've maintained matrimonial connection with her across 18 calendar years. Did you possess comprehensive knowledge?" Richard's mouth performed repetitive opening and closing motions. I monitored him searching for something characteristically clever to articulate, some methodological approach, transforming this circumstance into a narrative iteration where he emerged manifesting composed and controlling. What materialized instead communicated weakness and immediacy. "She neglected mentioning it," he articulated, manufacturing artificial amusement that registered ineffectively within the encompassing silence. "You comprehend, 20 years considerable occurrence. I'm certain she simply forgot to." "Your matrimonial partner preserved the chairman's existence," somebody articulated from the assembled group, articulation conveying less intentional cruelty and enhanced disbelief, yet those particularized words remained suspended like judicial pronouncement. I identified the vocalization, Dave Marsh, somebody occupying Richard's professional section within monetary operations, an individual my spouse had repeatedly complained about, designating him as opportunistic, insufficiently ambitious. Dave wasn't attempting Richard's humiliation. He was simply articulating externally what every chamber occupant currently conceptualized internally. Richard's complexion manifested through sequential chromatic transformations. I'd previously experienced my spouse projecting annoyance, irritation, condescension, yet I'd never witnessed this particular category of exposure. Exposure belonging to somebody who'd expended years constructing a specific existential representation and observed it fragmenting within approximately 5 minutes' duration. "Doubtlessly substantial material Lisa maintains private," he articulated, endeavoring restoration, directing his ocular focus toward me with something penetrating positioning itself behind his visual expression, a cautionary communication I'd acknowledged throughout 18 matrimonial years. "Refrain from complicating this circumstance." "She doesn't genuinely appreciate prominence," he persisted, attempting additional recovery. "Plainly not," Charles articulated, and his inflection now carried something approaching sharpness, delicate but unmistakable, someone communicating like a male who'd established commercial dominion through precise individual assessment comprehension. Which renders it exponentially more extraordinary that she never exercised what she'd performed for personal advantage, acknowledgement, financial resources, even cordial appreciation documentation. That's uncommon, Richard. That's the category of individual most commercial institutions would perpetually pursue, and you maintained her at your residential table across 18 calendar years. I perpetuated quietude throughout everything. I didn't contradict Richard. I didn't articulate defensive positions regarding myself. I didn't require it because, for considerable duration, somebody else manifested as my perceiver, and my quietude would existence. Tonight, I'd like initiating that process. Richard proceeded forward, straightening his outer garment slightly, already presuming the invitation encompassed him correspondingly, the manner every portal continuously opened for me throughout our matrimonial connection, somehow transformed into aperture he traversed initially. Charles' ocular focus flicked toward him, civil yet conclusive. Mrs. Walker represents my guest throughout this evening, he articulated, and inflection remained devoid of hostility, simply perspicuous, the category of articulation delineating demarcation without elevating its acoustic intensity. I perceived my spouse positioned there before his professional associates, his commercially influential superiors, before everybody whose professional respect he'd expended his existence pursuing, and experienced recognition that he'd simply suffered quiet public marginalization. I registered something unfamiliar traverse my thoracic cavity as Charles presented his upper extremity, and I accepted it, locomoting in direction of that anterior table while 300 individuals monitored our progression. It constituted something quieter than victory. It communicated like recognition manifesting finally, and comprehending what magnitude I'd overlooked recognition without ever permitting consciousness acknowledgement. Positioned at that anterior table, encompassed within porcelain and conversation I couldn't readily integrate with, I registered my consciousness drifting rearward through 18 matrimonial years, interrogating precisely how I'd transformed into somebody whom nobody at that table, incorporating my spouse himself, genuinely comprehended. I encountered Richard when approximately 25 calendar years old, a pair of calendar years subsequent to that nocturnal occurrence along Route 9. He already manifested ambitious, still ascending lower occupational rankings within a mid-sized commercial transportation corporation, aesthetically appealing with severe-featured charm, the category of male who manufactured sensation of being chosen whenever optical focus, directed toward you, and sensation of invisibility when it didn't. I misconstrued his passionate nature for substantive profundity. I misconstrued his controlling inclinations for powerful resolve. I possessed sufficient youth and sufficient fatigue from sustained double occupational rotations for remaining physiologically operational that experiencing selection by somebody manifesting, so positionally assured regarding forthcoming circumstances felt like salvation. Smallness didn't develop instantaneously, and that particular reality represents something society commonly fails comprehending regarding matrimonial situations resembling mine. Richard never initiated structured dialogue instructing me to vanish. Rather, it manifested gradual deterioration distributed across temporal intervals. Initially, when I communicated desire completing my educational credentials, he'd demonstrate pleasant expression and articulate we presently lacked financial resources. Wasn't it exponentially crucial that somebody concentrated upon residential administration while his professional elevation accelerated? When I experienced enthusiasm regarding contractual occupational positioning with nearby charitable organization, he inquired what colleagues would conceptualize regarding a female displaying his surname, accepting retail equivalent compensation. When I articulated perspective during celebratory gatherings, offered opinion throughout residential social occasions, manufactured enthusiastic vocalization regarding my own articulation, I'd perceive that specific regard. The corrective visual communication articulating I'd humiliated him repeatedly. You're basically not appropriately conditioned for organizational existence, Lisa. he communicated years previously when I'd interrogated concerning administrative occupational application through his commercial organization. Particular individuals manifest as naturally equipped for that professional atmosphere. You're authentically superior at, you comprehend, household maintenance activities. I acknowledged his evaluation. That particular reality perpetually generates discomfort in retrospect. I permitted him that perspective for prolonged duration, permitted it to substitute for genuine self-comprehension. I discontinued interrogating whether his characterization held authenticity. I never communicated specifics regarding that male, within thaw. T-channel to Richard since it genuinely never manifested as significant. For my consciousness, it represented single nocturnal occurrence amongst thousands, fundamental reaction undertaken, unfamiliar individual assisted, nothing demonstrating exceptional remarkability beyond assistance, provided someone requiring physical support. I'd never retained that recollection as something requiring secretiveness or shame. I'd simply catalogued it as minor occurrence. Charles, positioned adjacent me throughout that anterior table, apparently perceived directional movement of my cognitive processes. He established momentary communication through hushed articulation, pitched exclusively for my comprehension above chamber background noise. I revisited that healthcare facility tripled throughout subsequent calendar years, he articulated. I maintained dialogue with nursing personnel who could scarcely remember that particular nocturnal occurrence. Throughout my 30-year period, when I'd ultimately accumulated sufficient financial resources accomplishing it appropriately, I commissioned someone specializing in locating individuals. He succeeded acquiring nothing. Lisa represented commonly distributed appellation, and you generated zero traceable documentation. I perpetually failed succeeding. I remained uninformed regarding anybody's investigative efforts. I communicated softly. I maintained that outer rap, he articulated, and something within his vocal inflection fractured microscopically on those particular articulations. The one you applied to my cranium, I genuinely cannot explain why I perpetually retained possession. It's existed within a container in my workplace throughout 2 calendar decades. This ridiculous sentimental item, fully grown masculine individual maintaining, hemorrhage-stained, rapping solely, because it represented exclusive substantiation you manifested authentically, instead of mere consciousness hallucination during partial unconsciousness and comprehensive terror. I lacked sophisticated verbal response for comprehending that somebody constructed shrine originating from your magnanimity while you overlooked their physiognomy entirely. I want candor from you, Charles persisted, hushed inflection, momentarily examining Richard's positioning, 2 tables away, motionless and monitoring our interaction like somebody attempting auditory reception without obvious observation. Throughout those months expended recovering, contemplating that female who preserved me and subsequently evaporated, it transformed beyond simple gratification. It metamorphosed into something surpassing thanksgiving. I constructed comprehensive conceptualization regarding you intellectually, an iteration probably unfair, excessively flawless, excessively romanticized. I articulated internally that should I ever succeed in locating you, I'd merely communicate gratitude and permit you persisting with your existence. He paused, and I registered him deliberating whether articulating continuation constituted appropriate determination. But positioned here this nocturnal occurrence, observing how your spouse articulated concerning you, witnessing how this chamber reacted to comprehending your authentic identification, I don't conceptualize the female I constructed was unfair whatsoever. I conceptualize she manifested exactly accurate, and I conceptualize she's occupied chambers identical to this throughout considerable duration, without anybody registering her actual presence. Facial area temperature escalated perceptibly, not fundamentally from admiration exactly, yet from peculiar vertigo experienced through genuine recognition, from somebody subsequent to sustained duration of bare acceptance. My ocular focus traversed the chamber in Richard's directional orientation, who maintained observation exhibiting expression I'd acknowledged throughout each contentious interchange. Rigid mandible, commanded fury simmering just beneath controlled external presentation. He despised everything occurring. He despised that I'd transformed into circumstantial focal point he couldn't manipulate or reduce. For monetary consideration, I communicated to Charles, I harbor zero regrets regarding non-disclosure. I didn't execute it acquiring recognition. I executed it because you necessitated assistance and I was available. I comprehend, he articulated, facial muscles finally softening toward something more delicate. That's precisely the foundation for why it manifested so substantially significant. Throughout that anterior table, a female participant regarding board governance inclined in my directional orientation, articulating cordially while anticipating impressive response, coordinating with the communicational narrative. What occupational responsibilities do you currently pursue? She articulated, openly presuming something professionally distinguished would synchronize with my narrative. I commenced articulation, I'm not cur. Ently employed, that I'd remained professionally inactive for considerable duration, that Richard consistently articulated one income sufficed, providing all residential requirements, remained appropriately administered, and I registered that particular embarrassment commencing its advancement via my consciousness. Subsequently, I arrested myself. I examined Charles, observed his wrapping maintained within a container throughout temporal duration, observed his conviction that I'd qualified for pursuit, and for initially since considerable duration previously, I experienced zero impulse for reality reduction manufactured for anybody else's residential comfort. That gala subsided approaching 11 o'clock, and positioning my external covering at that parking structure entrance, Richard anticipated my arrival beside that elevator apparatus, appendages folded, mandible position tight, in that characteristic expression I'd absorbed throughout 18 calendar years, like meteorological prediction instrument. I comprehended anteceding his articulation that confrontational meteorological system had accumulated substantive momentum throughout that evening, and I approached initiation of its complete discharge. That elevator mechanism sealed, and he didn't anticipate seclusion. What precisely transpired, he articulated, his vocal register maintained low yet penetrating, reverberating across concrete construction. You couldn't communicate that you comprehended Charles Whitmore, 20 calendar years of matrimonial companionship, and you merely overlooked mentioning you preserved my commercial superior's vital existence. I wasn't cognizant regarding his professional positioning, I articulated. I couldn't recognize his physiognomy until this evening, Richard. I supported one male within a channel. I didn't document the narrative for subsequent application. You manufactured appearance resembling an imbecile before everybody whose professional perspective you've expended your existence pursuing. He manipulated that elevator apparatus's command mechanism repetitively, despite it currently maintaining illuminated status, a behavioral pattern when he necessitated directional focus for his appendages, since idle positioning generated anxiety. Do you comprehend what individuals will articulate beginning Monday? That I lack comprehensive knowledge regarding my spouse, that she's been withholding commercial connection to organizational management this prolonged duration. I wasn't withholding anything, I articulated, and I registered something within my vocal register manifesting surprising, consistent stability absent from analogous exchanges previously. I provided assistance to someone necessitating it. That characterizes completeness until this evening. He maintained insufficient capacity for concentration. He repeatedly constructed circumstantial interpretations, positioning himself as wronged entity, excessively preoccupied for genuine auditory reception of alternative perspectives. We traversed toward our automobile in comprehensive quietude, and throughout the moment that mechanical closure completed, he initiated again, hushed now, yet somehow containing amplified sharpness resulting from that reduction. You humiliated me this evening, he articulated, positioned there permitting him maintaining your hand, permitting that entire chamber observing, permitting Dave Marsh articulate that particular commentary regarding my spousal comprehension. Did you experience satisfaction? Did this communicate as performance fabricated for your advantage? You instructed me avoiding humiliation anteceding we traversed through that entrance, I articulated in response. You dictated increased enthusiasm, diminished verbal contribution, continuous compaction of physicality. I executed exactly your directives, Richard. I occupied a corner and maintained quietude. Charles Whitmore manifested as the individual who traversed that chamber and fundamentally altered everything, not me. Don't feign innocence, he articulated. His appendage pressure upon our automobile's command apparatus intensified as he navigated beyond that underground construction, frontal luminescence sweeping across vacant concrete. Males resembling that particular individual don't experience emotional response regarding some restaurant laborer from 20 calendar years prior unless something more substantial constituted the hidden reality. What precisely transpired that evening, Lisa? What precisely are you withholding? That insinuation penetrated like corporeal strike, substantially repellent for the manner in which he dispensed it so casually, like he merely mused aloud rather than accusing his matrimonial partner of something morally corrupt within an underground parking structure at 11 o'clock nocturnal. I registered something ancient and exhausted within my consciousness ultimately relinquish. That final thread of metaphorical rope I'd been maintaining across extended duration. You experienced embarrassment regarding me anteceding anybody within that chamber even comprehended my designation, I articulated, rotating to examine him directly. You've maintained embarrassment regarding me throughout considerable duration, Richard. The methodological manner I clothe my physique, the manner I articulate, the actuality that I never completed educational credentials, because you articulated we lacked financial capacity. You constructed existence, where I manifested purely for generating favorable impressions throughout public occasions and manufactured invisibility throughout remaining duration. And currently you experience fury because momentarily I registered superior significance than you. He provided zero articulation in response. That particularly spoke volumes. Rather, his vocal inflection descended into something considerably more chilling, exponentially deliberate. You demonstrate considerable prudence monitoring your behavioral patterns, he articulated. Should this transforms into circumstantial calamity, should individuals commence discussing this publicly, that reflects upon my professional standing. You comprehend that, correct? Should you transform this into something exceeding its authentic magnitude, you'll experience regret. I gazed outward toward metropolitan luminescence, becoming indistinct, while traversing that velocity, and articulated nothing subsequently throughout that journey. I'd acquired comprehensive knowledge, across 18 matrimonial years, that no articulation variety throughout that category of dispute provided protective advantage opposite consequences, resulting from demonstrating perspective. I proceeded toward sleeping accommodation, that nocturnal occasion with his intimidating articulation persisting, suspended inside atmospheric space between us, and I registered minimal sleep throughout that time frame. Monday morning manifested differently than my spouse anticipated. He received communication directing him toward administrative workplace personnel anteceding 9 o'clock. I accumulated particulars subsequently, assembled from communication he transmitted that evening, his vocal register registering terror I'd never previously experienced from him. It demonstrated that Charles Whitmore had accomplished more than occupying me at that anterior table throughout Friday nocturnal occasion. Following his fascination regarding who rescued his existence, transported him into his organization's administrative infrastructure, he commenced formulating hushed interrogations, the variety that powerful males articulate whenever something registers incorrectly within their understanding. What surfaced wasn't aesthetically favorable. Richard had, throughout multiple calendar years, appropriated recognition for occupational proposition originated by junior monetary analyst, achievement acquiring him recent professional advancement. He'd fabricated fiscal documentation regarding dual regional journeys. He'd utilized photographic depictions of our residential dwelling, photographic depictions of me positioned at commercial social gathering throughout prior calendar year, grinning throughout solar dress, I genuinely couldn't recall selecting, dispersed throughout organizational newsletter profile depicting him as dedicated matrimonial partner, constructing idealized American existence. Simultaneously, privately communicating I manifested as embarrassment to him. Charles hadn't commissioned investigation emerging from competitive emotion or individual sentiment directing toward me. That constituted fundamentally incompatible with his character I'd ultimately comprehend. He basically initiated detailed examination regarding this male whose spouse had quietly, requesting absolutely nothing in reciprocation, fundamentally altered his lifetime trajectory. And what he discovered necessitated zero assistance from me for substantiation, nothing except comprehensive authenticity. Richard designated it persecution. He articulated it represented retaliation. He articulated it everything except what it genuinely manifested, straightforward reality, finally apprehending somebody who'd existed throughout sustained period, presuming insufficient magnitude, existed watching him methodically. 3 calendar weeks transpired before I subsequently encountered Charles Whitmore exterior of that gala's atmospheric haze. He transmitted communication initially, something I appreciated more than he probably conceptualized, interrogating whether I'd entertain meeting for beverage preparation. Zero strategic objective, exclusively opportunity for dialogue without 300 individuals observing. I selected modest placement distant from commercial institutions since I required some place where I could still recognize myself inside that background reflective surface. He'd already been occupying that position when I arrived, nobody accompanying him, zero administrative personnel maintaining tablet devices, exclusively someone manifesting exhausted who elevated too hastily upon recognizing my arrival, like experiencing nervousness. Experiencing him, absent that ballroom magnificence felt peculiar, simply individual, slightly visibly anxious. I appreciate your appearance, he articulated, manipulating my seating apparatus antecedent to my independent execution, long-standing behavioral pattern acquired throughout his life previously, predating his acquisition of wealth sufficiently for performance appearance. I wanted articulating apologies toward you, regarding what? I interrogated, experiencing genuine bewilderment. Within my consciousness, he manifested as exclusively non-culpable individual throughout that complete evening. Regarding converting your existence into something inverted, he articulated, grasping both appendages around his beverage preparation receptacle like necessitating location for his nervous movement. I've contemplated this consistently subsequent to that nocturnal occasion. I traversed into that chamber searching for conclusion I'd pursued for 2 calendar decades, and I acquired it in worst possible methodology, antecedent your spouse, antecedent his colleagues. I deliberately failed contemplating what that moment would eventually necessitate when you returned toward your residential location. You didn't necessitate charging myself anything I hadn't already been gradually surrendering throughout extended duration, I articulated, and I manifested absolute honesty. You exclusively rendered it manifest. He examined me throughout extended period, and I registered him determining something, some meticulous, deliberate determination regarding appropriate subsequent articulation. I want articulating clarity regarding particular matter, he articulated. I don't manifest as intention capturing you from your matrimonial union. I'm not utilizing anything, my professional positioning, that investigative procedure, absolutely anything, for manufacturing obligation sensation toward me. That constitutes fundamentally incompatible with somebody I want characterizing myself as. I invested 2 calendar decades contemplating you as conceptualization, somebody I maintained obligation toward. I'm not interested perpetuating subsequent 2 calendar decades manufacturing you experience obligated by that historical occurrence. Something interior, my thoracic cavity, lightened perceptibly. Strain I hadn't registered perpetuating materialized. That particular apprehension gratitude might ultimately solidify into something demanding repayment potential. 20 calendar years previously, he articulated quieter, you preserved my existence. Currently, I simply want you discontinuing the gradual loss of your own. I delayed response production. I manipulated my beverage preparation through mechanical rotation, though I hadn't dispensed anything requiring that manipulation, essentially purchasing temporal intervals, because authentic response necessitated articulation. I'd remained interrogating myself that identical interrogative, nightly subsequent to that gala moment, resting alongside someone who'd transmitted threatening communication rather than providing consolation. What had my existence become specifically? I endeavored remembering my last determination made purely because I personally wanted it rather than its consequence for Richard's temperamental regulation or residential environment's fragile equilibrium preservation. I couldn't discover one. Not throughout recent months. Maybe not throughout extended calendar years. I'd constructed my physique into configuration, appropriately accommodating interior angles of his existence, and throughout that procedure, I'd ceased registering someone beneath that external form, someone previously manifesting wants and desires. Richard persisted attempting restoration throughout that similar temporal interval, using techniques conforming to his character. He appeared throughout our residential location, one nocturnal occasion, transporting botanical specimens, and commencing apology previously ascending to his vocal articulation, antecedent deposit of mechanical apparatus for entrance. I've persisted under substantial professional stress, he articulated, positioning throughout our residential preparation area with botanical specimens manifesting like protective barrier. I transmitted articulations I didn't genuinely communicate. You comprehend I don't genuinely conceptualize you've perpetrated anything improper that particular evening. I examined those botanical specimens, economical marketplace carnations, the variety individuals acquire when facilitating rapid correction of something fragmented rather than experiencing authentic regret. I contemplated that underground parking structure, his vocal register transmitting frigid warning, that intimidating communication enveloped with in cautionary instruction regarding my behavioral patterns, reflecting upon his professional standing. Does this communication originate from apprehension that I've performed something inappropriate? I interrogated. Or because you're concerned regarding what occurs to your occupational positioning currently that investigative procedure commenced? He refused providing hastened articulation. That transmitted everything. I necessitate communicating genuinely regarding what occurred within my consciousness throughout 3 calendar weeks since that occasion because it avoided dramatic manifestation, not anything society ordinarily envisions as transformative juncture. 0 individual instant of enlightened understanding, 0 illuminative moment. It progressed more slowly, akin to gradual awakening from protracted sleep, achieving consciousness incrementally regarding how compressed the chamber I'd occupied constituted. I commenced remembering elements regarding myself I'd permitted manifesting dormant. I'd previously cherished drawing, genuine illustrated compositions, I'd populate journals with antecedent Richard, articulated it communicated as temporal misuse. I'd previously manifested perspectives regarding governmental structures, literary compositions, world occurrence, and previously communicated them, allowed antecedent I acquired knowledge, that articulating them necessitated exceeding what preservation could sustain. I commenced remembering that the female who descended into channel during precipitation for preserving unfamiliar male had manifested courageous, authentically, significantly courageous, and that bravery hadn't simply vanished. It had been deliberately buried beneath extended duration of reduction directives. The evening I ultimately resolved, Richard appeared through our residential location later than his customary schedule from administrative workplace dialogue. His complexion presented as colorless, his vocal registry diminished to something I'd never experienced. He occupied position across from me at our residential preparation table and articulated, preventing direct optical focus, that he probably faced structured professional correction, potentially occupational conclusion, contingent upon investigative findings regarding those fabricated expenditure submissions, and that analyst's intellectual property. I require you positioning yourself beside me presently, he articulated. Whatever manifests, I necessitate people conceptualizing our matrimonial union demonstrate stability, that this hasn't fragmented us. I finally, completely comprehended that even throughout his maximum disadvantage, he persisted requesting performance from me. Persisting requesting me serving as theatrical element, making his existence manifest acceptable to external observers. I rose from that furniture arrangement, traversed toward my ornamentation receptacle, and extracted my matrimonial signifier. I positioned it upon that preparation table's exterior between us, that precious metallic circular object capturing illumination, 18 calendar years compressed into one minor, noiseless gesture. "You didn't humiliate me, Richard," I articulated, and my vocal articulation maintained consistent stability. "I exposed you. Those manifest as fundamentally distinct matters, and I conceptualize, interior somewhere past your external facade, you've perpetually comprehended that distinction." I traversed upward toward our sleeping accommodation, experiencing simultaneous sensation, as though atmospheric pressure around me had expanded. I didn't transmute into Charles Whitmore's emotional sanctuary the weekly periods subsequent to my residential departure. I necessitate articulating that unambiguously because it would have communicated as narrative variety society would have readily comprehended, that complete circular arc. Rather, I occupied modest singular occupancy residential arrangement beyond metropolitan boundaries, the variety manifesting second-hand furnishings and faulty culinary water mechanism. I rectified that particular mechanism, utilizing recorded technological guidance and considerably more determination than competency. That matrimonial dissolution proceeded throughout 4 months antecedent finalization. Richard declined substantial contention, which manifested surprising until I comprehended his foundation. He remained excessively preoccupied with his occupational deterioration for dedicating substantial concentration toward our conclusion. That authorized investigative examination substantiated what Charles had quietly suspected, those fabricated fiscal submissions that misattributed occupational achievement. And Richard received demotion from his administrative placement, transferred toward diminished occupational capacity, substantially diminished occupational chamber, and exponentially diminished attendance audience for his manufactured charisma. He didn't experience complete devastation. NT transmitting that unambiguously, because I never wanted his comprehensive ruination, exclusively straightforward reality. He maintained his occupational placement, maintained income resources, maintained his dignity somewhat compromised yet fundamentally intact. He merely required ultimately inhabiting a world where consequences matched extended duration of believing nobody maintaining sufficient interest for careful monitoring. I registered him singularly during that authorized legal venue for executing remaining documentation. He manifested considerably senior to remembrance, exhausted throughout methodology, transcending mere insufficient sleep. "I hope you experience satisfaction," he articulated, and I couldn't distinguish whether that communicated from resentment or something approximating authentic hope. I transmitted identical articulation in reciprocation, genuinely intending it, because harboring rancor towards somebody who'd consequently surrendered power over my diurnal structure manifested like squandering that autonomy I'd fought extensively for acquiring. Charles remained without communication throughout extended timeframes throughout that temporal interval, appropriately respecting that atmospheric space I apparently necessitated, though he transmitted correspondence when that matrimonial dissolution completed, elementary and affectionate, zero obligation compressed into those articulations. Rather, our pathways intersected gradually, authentically, throughout something I hadn't anticipated. He transmitted invitation regarding venue inspection at Foundation. His commercial organization had discreetly financed throughout extended duration. Organizational apparatus supporting females, reconstructing existence, subsequent to departure from domineering or mistreating matrimonial situations. Furnishing occupational preparation, momentary residential assistance, and something I acquired comprehending, I required similarly to everybody else participating there. Communal gathering, with females understanding authentically what abandonment of self-reduction necessitated experiencing. I experienced resistance when he initially suggested participation extending beyond simple attendance. Charitable participation felt like solitary phenomenon. Occupying substantive responsibility felt like acknowledging preparation for external recognition throughout modified manner I wasn't certain I could genuinely trust. But something regarding traversing those chambers, encountering females in their 30-something years and 50-something years and 60-something years, all acquiring learning to have confidence in their independent vocal articulations, felt diminished like generous assistance and approached genuine recognition. I articulated acceptance. I initiated with modest contribution organizing communicational seminars, distributing elements of my biographical narrative whenever registration felt appropriate, never fabricating, exclusively providing it authentically toward females necessitating comprehension that reorienting at 43 didn't characterize catastrophe. It communicated as commencement. Throughout singular calendar year, I delivered regular communications at organizational functions. That ancient apprehension regarding occupying excessive chamber gradually, deliberately transformed into something progressively consistent. Charles and I structured our association similarly, gradual, nothing surpassing that primary occurrence at that gala, which had truthfully provided adequate spectacle throughout my existence. We maintained dinner occasionally. We maintained occasional evening vocal communications regarding nothing significant, written compositions and atmospheric phenomena, and granular surface textures of uncomplicated existence, which registered like extravagance subsequent to 18 calendar years of interaction, basically functioning like administrative institutional dialogue for Richard's narcissistic psychology. Charles perpetually refused manufacturing sensation that I harbored obligation from that nocturnal occasion traversing 20 calendar years, and throughout that forbearance, something authentic materialized between us, unhurried and genuine. 9 months subsequent to that gala, the Foundation orchestrated its yearly contribution accumulation mechanism, that identical category of magnificent architectural interior locational arrangement, where this comprehensive narrative initiated. This instance, I wasn't obscuring myself throughout a chamber inside economically accessible navy coloring. I positioned myself at that public articulation apparatus wearing deeper verdant pigmentation I deliberately selected exclusively for myself, observing assembled individuals who'd manifested for supporting females resembling the female I'd previously embodied. I discovered Charles amongst that anterior arrangement antecedent my articulation commencement, his optical focus consistent upon min. Demonstrating satisfaction, not manifesting like proprietorship, exclusively authentic celebration regarding perceiving somebody turn into genuinely themselves. Throughout extended duration, I conceptualized that quietude communicated as forcefulness. I transmitted throughout that amplified apparatus, my vocal registry carrying unobstructed and consistent through architectural expanse. I theorized that gradual disappearance throughout successive calendar years fundamentally represented technique, maintaining familial union cohesive. It required somebody from 2 calendar decades previously traversing back, throughout my existence, for remembering me, that the female who descended into channel, throughout precipitation for preserving someone else wasn't ever authentically vanished. She merely anticipated authorization for reappearance. But occasionally, authentic forcefulness doesn't constitute maintaining silence for tranquility maintenance. Occasionally forcefulness communicates finally permitting the world perceiving your designation. That acoustic reception consequential to that communication registered diminished like commendation and approached something approximating recognition. Multitudes of females within that chamber inclined frontward since they'd personally comprehended authentically what those articulations had necessitated articulating externally. Subsequently, Charles discovered me adjacent that chamber's perimeter dual beverage containers manifesting within his appendages, presenting me one through diminutive, expectant expression. Would you accommodate accompanying me throughout meal preparation at some future temporal interval? He interrogated. Not because you preserved my existence 2 calendar decades previously, yet because I'd appreciate forming familiarity with you presently as the female you've deliberately transformed yourself into becoming. I examined that individual who'd maintained 2 calendar decades, subsequently maintained patience, once more permitting me discovering my independent navigational trajectory. And I registered something installing permanently within my thoracic cavity, fundamentally unconnected with obligation or salvation. This iteration, I articulated, manifesting enjoyment. You don't require pursuing me further. I'm here.